everybody to day 3 of the meeting. I think we had a useful series of discussions yesterday. I did say that we'd give you an idea of what the plans were for the retirement benefit plans work, and my understanding from having talked to David earlier on today is that Joe has made good progress in terms of picking up the member comments, and I think that's, you know, so I'm getting a message saying I'm muted at the moment.
Yeah, you dropped out. You dropped out.
Okay. So I spoke to David earlier on today, and he, you know, he's got to have a look at the progress Joe has made. But I think the idea is that that should be sort of in a place where it can be, the updated version can be sent round members sort of, I think, during tomorrow. Is that the idea, David?
Yeah, it should be coming out later tomorrow.
Okay, so that's you know, good work in terms of the turnaround, and that will allow us to have a look at those changes on Tuesday next week. Now, if we can have that both in markup and plain, please, when that comes around, that'll be really helpful to see where the changes are, but also to be able to kind of get a better appreciation of how it actually reads after that. You know, thanks to Joe and you for, and I think Dave's going to be involved in the review process on that. So thanks everyone for helping us in that way. So then moving on to the item that we were in the middle of discussing yesterday, this was the next phase of the limited scope update of the conceptual framework. And we got through the first 2 discussion areas, assets and unit of account. I think during that we picked up the one substantive issue, which was finally landing the proposed new definition for assets. Other than that, I think we had quite a few different drafting changes that will need to be put through. But I think it was just that one substantive issue. And I think with that, then, John, we move into the 3rd substantive paper that you brought on liabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and for some, good night, everybody. Yeah, as Ian says, we're on to the 3rd of the 3 substantive papers, agenda item 6.2.3, and this is on the restructuring of the liabilities section. And again, Joe's kindly going to share the screen. I want to start by firstly apologising and putting up the definition of a liability, which should have been in both the agenda paper and in the draft ED. Now, due to an omission on my part, if you recall at the end of the September meeting, Lucy made the comment that we should make some minor adjustments to the definition of a liability, and I was instructed to go away and make those changes, provided I didn't identify any unforeseen consequences. I didn't, should have done this in October, but didn't, and it carried through to this meeting. So on this slide, we have the definition of a liability, which will be proposed in the exposure draft, and on which there will be a specific matter for comment. And that is, as written, a present obligation of the entity to transfer resources as a result of past events. And in this slide, we've got the wording in the 2014 framework definition struck out and the new words underlined. And I think I've finally got that right. So Ian, at that point, it might be an idea just to sort of stop and let members take stock of that.
Yes, thanks, John.
And apologies again from me.
Okay, thanks for that, John. So I just want to check whether, obviously that is a change that we agreed conditionally a while back. I just want to check whether anybody has any questions on that. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this stage, so thank you for that, John. So,
and that will be in the version that you will see next week or next time up. Okay, thank you. Joe, can we move on then? Right. Can we shift to the next slide? Right.
We're in the display mode or whatever it is. Can we just get it back into the full screen?
Thanks, Joe. Brilliant. Thank you. Could we go back one? Right. No. And one more. Yeah. What we've done, the board sponsor, Ian, looked at the current structure of the section of Chapter 5 on liabilities and discussed with me whether a restructuring of this section, aligning better with the components of the definition, might be more reader friendly. And in that regard, we looked at what the ISB had done in the 2018 framework. And my initial reaction was, do we actually want to do this at the moment? But when I looked at it, I very much agreed with Ian that some primary relocation of material would actually make the flow of this section of Chapter 5 really rather better. So what we've done is to restructure the section into 3 sections. Firstly, a section on obligations in paragraphs 5.15 to 5.15F. Then the material on transfer of resources, which we'd already agreed in September, runs from paragraphs 5.16 to 5.16F, and we've renamed the section on past events present obligations as a result of past events. And what that does is it links a present obligation rather better to a past event. And those are paragraphs 5.17 to 5.17D. Now, material which has simply been relocated is double underlined, whereas the new material, which wasn't in the 2014 framework, that is single underlined with any changes to it struck out. So I hope that's reasonably straightforward to follow. When it comes to actually publishing the ED, we might make some further modifications to make certain that readers are absolutely clear what is proposed new material and what is proposed relocated material. And you can see that in Appendix A or in the draft ED itself at agenda item 6.3.1. So if we could move on, please, Joe. The board sponsor and staff recommendation is to adopt the revised and restructured section liabilities in paragraphs 5.13 to 5.17G of ED 81. And at that point, Ian, I'll close and be open for any clarifications or other questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, for that summary of how the proposals emerged. So could I just get comments? I think there are 1 or 2 bits of changes in drafting, but I just want to take comments first on our members' content with the restructuring, and then I'll take comments on any of the change new material. So any comments first on restructuring? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from several members, so I think we're content with that. Can I take any comments on any of the sort of bits of link drafting or those changes from members then? Yes, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, John. I have a comment in relation to paragraph 5.15a. Now this section is called obligations because we are starting with obligations, but the last sentence is still referring to present obligation, and this may be a bit confusing.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Camira. I did actually note that point myself when I was trying to explain the rationale for this. I'm just turning to the paragraph now. Right.
So, Camira, are you suggesting that we should delete the sentence that begins, however, it is not necessary?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
that would be an idea. Yeah.
This is the last sentence of paragraph 5.15a, starting, however, as Ian said, however, it's not essential. There's a reference to a present obligation. Now, if we're being logical here, as Camira has indicated, we should not be actually discussing present obligations until we get to the third subsection. So that, what I'd suggest is that does need some, probably similar to the previous sentence, we can delete present obligation and say, in order for an obligation to give rise to a liability.
Okay. Everyone okay if we delete that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got Lucy and then Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is more on the captioning on legal and non-legally binding obligations under obligations. In this page, it was struck out, but in the ED, it is still appearing there. So I think it should also be crossed out in the draft ED.
Yeah.
And also, it's just an editorial, but I think I just have to mention it now. In 5.15b, we have to delete already the an outflow. So it.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. 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 Could, through the chair, could I ask Lucy if she could just send a very brief email with those, and I'll pick them up in the final as I develop it to the version you'll see next week.
All right. Okay, I'll do that.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Lucy. So
Chair?
Renee, next.
Can I?
Oh, sorry, Lucy.
Yeah, can I?
Sorry, have you got?
Sorry about that, but or maybe I am advanced already. In 5.15f, in the first bullet, I noticed that this is just a relocated paragraph, but I noticed that we have specified that the specific statement must be current. However, in paragraph 4.31 of the IPSASB conceptual framework, it states only specific statements, but there could be some reasons why we have this. We have identified that it should be specific current statement in the 2014 conceptual framework. I'm just curious, but I think it should, the word current must be deleted also. Thank you.
Should I respond to that, Ian?
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that point, Lucy. I mean, this material, as indicated, is located from the current framework. So that wording is the wording that the board adopted in 2014. Just to clarify, we're dealing here with paragraph 5.14 and the first bullet point. And Lucy's point is that we should delete current because current doesn't appear in paragraph 4.31 of the ISB framework, which discusses more or less the same issue. My recall, and this is not in the basis for conclusion, is that current was meant to emphasize that it's something that has actually already been stated at the reporting date. So if you like to use the vernacular, it's belts and braces, the term we use in English. I mean, given that this is a limited scope update project and that the paragraph hasn't really caused any problems thus far, my recommendation would be to keep it, but perhaps Ian, I could go back through you.
Yeah, I think probably that would be my suggestion, actually, if you're okay, Lucy, with that, for those reasons. Okay.
Okay,
thanks.
thank you.
Thanks a lot.
That confirmation, Lucy. So moving on then to Renee and then Camira.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to follow up on Camira's prior comment at 5.15A, the suggestion of deleting that last sentence. I do find that point very important. So can you just remind me, John, are we just deleting it because this concept is explained somewhere in the text, or we're not eliminating it, are we?
No, sorry, Renee, and thanks for raising this because I may have been unclear. We're not proposing to delete the principle. So we're not proposing to delete the sentence, but we are going to delete the word present. So there will be some word smithing, something like it's not essential to know the identity of the external party before the time of settlement for an obligation and a liability to exist, or for an obligation to give rise to a liability, because I think it is an important principle that needs to be retained. And
thank you very much.
Is in the ISB framework. Thank you.
Okay, so that wasn't quite how I'd summarize, John, but I do agree that that's a good way forward on that. If everybody
sorry, Ian, if I misunderstood.
No, I think that's because of the point that Renee raised quite properly. I think that's a neater way forward on that, if everyone's okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Camira, you were the person that raised that in the first place. Are you okay with that? Do you want to come in again?
Yes, I have a more general comment in how to explain or make it clearer the relationship between obligation, present obligation, and also this binding, legally binding and non-legally binding obligations. Because from the, especially when reading the last section of present obligation as results of past events, so the text refers repetitively to the non-legally binding obligation. So the relationship between all these terms, if we can, how we plan to communicate it, or if there is a way that we can do it in the text, or it would be more like a communication strategy on how to explain or be able to differentiate between those terms. Thanks.
Okay.
John?
Yes. I think the key point is that an obligation becomes a present obligation as a result of a past event. Now, this is a clarification resulting from the restructuring, and it is in the second sentence of paragraph 5.17. Which has largely just been retained from the current framework. What I suggest, Ian, is that I have a look at that and liaise with Camira as to some wording?
I think we need to be careful not to, I mean, I think some of this is actually just because there's quite a lot of markup here, actually. The other thing is that we do need to be very clear that there is an important distinction between legally or legal and equivalent means and non-legally binding, which is certainly relevant in terms of the revenue project. And indeed, we have a paper on that, that particular issue later. So I think, Camira, your question is really rather of one of, if you like, explanation and clarity rather than a change of principle. Is that right?
That's right. It's more, yes, more explanation how to for preparers to make it easier for them to understand what is the difference or what is more overarching, or yes, that's
so John, I think what might be helpful is just to have a look at the basis for conclusions and see if there's any additional clarification that we can get into the basis of conclusions that will address Camira's point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that, Camira. Over to Patricia next.
Thank you. I have one comment. In the description of obligation, sometimes the expression is has little or no realistic, and sometimes only no realistic. And initially, I understand the question as only editorial, but after maybe it's a question about the alignment with ISB conceptual framework, because ISB is only no practical. It's not the same word, but is a different degree because here in the IPSASB conceptual framework, that is the expression has little.
Ian, should I
sorry, Patricia, I think that does, you put your finger on the issue there. John, do you want to just explain the rationale on that?
Well, firstly, Patricia's quite right that there's some inconsistent drafting here. Even though it is long-winded, I think we need to throughout adopt the term little or no realistic alternative to avoid. As Patricia's indicated, the ISB has used the rather more straightforward term no practical ability to avoid. The board decided, in light of the limited scope nature of this project, not to change the wording which was adopted in 2014. But I think it is important that I'm consistent throughout, so I use the term little or no realistic alternative rather than just no realistic alternative. So I will look at that in the redrafting, in the progression of the ED.
Okay.
Could I ask through you, Ian, if Patricia's okay with that?
Yeah, okay, thanks for that confirmation. Okay. Any other comments on the section then? Good, okay, thanks for that. So move us on then to the consideration of the specific matters for comment, John.
Yeah, the next paper 6.2.4 deals with the specific matters for comment. And what I've done is put these on a slide. So perhaps we could, if it's okay with you, Chair, it might be an idea if we just go through the 8 proposed specific matters for comment and then consider whether there are any further specific matters for comment that members feel we should explicitly ask, and indeed whether any of these specific matters for comment should be deleted. So,
well, can we pick up the three rather than do them each individually? Can we pick up the three that are on the slide at the moment? So the first three proposed specific matters for comment, and just see whether there are any comments that members want to raise.
if I could just say that specific matters for comment 1 and 2 relate to chapter 3. First one is on prudence, second one on materiality, which is the two areas where we are proposing modifications to that chapter.
Okay, thanks. Open up for comments on those.
Just to say, I've had an editorial from Scott on paragraph on the first one.
Okay, I'm only interested at this stage in matters of principle.
Yeah,
Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was John. Your last point reminded me. I think cross-referencing to the chapters or providing some sort of headings above each one would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other comments. Obviously, you'll pick up the editorial from Scott.
Yeah.
So we'll move us on to the next three, the next SMCs.
Okay, 4 to 6 all relate to chapter 5. The first one on the liability, the second one on transfer of resource, also in a liability. In fact, they're all to do with the liability.
Great, okay, thanks, John. So just take the screen down and see if there's any comments from members on those. Okay, so take us back to the slides then for the remaining matters for comment.
The last two relate to unit of account and the related topic of executory accounting principles. Specific matter for comment 8 is in 2 parts, and part B actually results from a specific direction from the board.
Okay, so just check comments on those. Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In SMC 7, there was a mention, there's a statement referring to the executory accounting principles. Can we just, since SMC 8 is about executory accounting principles, can we delete that from SMC 7?
Thanks, Lucy. John.
Sorry, bear with me 1 minute.
I mean, certainly from a stakeholder point of view, I think if we can, focus it so that people are absolutely clear on what they're actually responding on, that certainly must be helpful.
I mean, what I've tried to do here is to say, and this has been quite difficult, if you have comments on executory accounting principles, give those to us in specific matter for comment 8 rather than this one.
I think, John, let's, given that that follows on, I can see Lucy's point, and I suspect we may get some duplication anyway, but if we can focus the first one on should we add the section on unit of account, and then the second one specifically on executory contracts, I think we stand a chance of actually getting greater clarity. I agree it's slightly complicated, but I think having that additional point, that additional sentence, given it follows, the question follows on, I think it just overcomplicates it.
Okay.
So if that's okay, we'll take that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so Camira?
Thanks, Chair. I have a comment for specific matter or for comment number 8. We are referring there to the principles of executory contracts, but we are not mentioning the terms executory in the core text. So I imagine just in the future when we already have the final version.
Sorry, is that my?
Is it
No,
me?
I think we've lost Mira at this stage.
Yeah.
I think the point that she was trying to make is actually one on terminology. And when I do
Yeah.
read that, based on the discussion that we had yesterday, I think the answer to Camira's point is probably that we need to just clear through how we're going to use the headings in the basis for conclusions, because that's where the point came up yesterday. And then the terminology needs to be consistent in the SMC. John, so I think that's the instruction. I mean, I'm hoping that picked that up. I think we've lost Camira at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's the point.
Yeah. Okay, so if you take that as the instruction that we need to get the terminology that we're using consistent with the way in which we've approached it in the basis for conclusions.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll move then to Mike and then to Scott.
Thanks, Chair. So SMC 8 doesn't then ask the question, if you don't agree, what do you recommend? Which we do in all the other ones. So I'm just wondering whether we need it or not. I think we probably do.
Yeah, no, I agree, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Agreed. Scott.
Thank you. And I raised my hand just to confirm your conclusion. I'd raised the same, that Camiro's comment, I'd raised the same issue of John was the wording in 8 doesn't match the text. So I think you hit what Camiro was getting at. So I'd raise the same issue.
Yeah, okay. I think we agreed on the term binding arrangement yesterday. Right. We need to use that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And then I think we asked the catch-all question that you wanted to raise, which is, are there any additional SMCs that members feel are needed? And this is on both chapters 3 and 4 proposed limited scope updates. Okay. So I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think in terms of then the way forward on this, we have one substantive item, which is landing the definition of assets yesterday. And I don't think that was, it's actually more a matter of, you know, just getting the wording, the wording right. Sorry, I shouldn't have used right, actually, should I? Because it's rights that we're talking about on that.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
But basically, that's a specific issue that we need to work through. There's certainly a number of bits of editorial that need to be worked through. And just to underline that, we will need to take this through our normal editorial process. And the way in which that works is those members, we look for volunteers from members and TAs working with you know, staff and chair of task force and so on. So we've got the relevant people. And basically that process is to work through the editorials that we've received from members and to make sure that those are put through correctly, and that in doing so, there is those don't generate any substantive change to the text that members have approved. And the control on that is that Ross, who's independent of that process as Programme and Technical Director, does a review and reports to me on behalf of the board whether he's content that there are you know, there are no substantive changes, or alternatively, if he feels there's a matter of principle that has arisen through that process, then we would delay issue and that matter would come back to the board for discussion. So that's the way in which the editorial process actually works. Now, bearing that in mind, my proposal on the way forward on this one would be that we certainly need to agree that definition, which is of course crucial on assets. So my proposed way forward is that we move to approval subject to both discussion of that, the final version of that definition on Tuesday, and also subject to that editorial process. And I want to check, would members be content with that as the way forward, so that we would now give approval conditional on the outcome of both of those? Okay, everyone okay if we move forward in that way? Because I think that these sections are important and that will help us with other projects. Good, okay. So Ross, just advise us on what we need to do then in terms of due process at this stage.
So this is an exposure draft, so it's pretty simple for due process perspective. We basically just take our vote and then we'll document, as you said, in terms of the editorials as a subject to, and I expect we'll clear the other subject to noted on the asset definition next Wednesday. We'll bring that back as an individual item. So if everyone's okay, I think we just go to a vote now. So with that, sorry.
Lindy.
Sorry, just a question. What are we going to get back next week then? Only that one section or all the changes made thus far?
Just that one section. Because I think it's quite hard for members, you know, I'm conscious from a member point of view that we're going to get the material back on retirement benefit plans for review. And that clearly is a result of the discussions yesterday. I want to make sure members have time to, you know, really have a good look at that. On this one, I think we've discussed all the items, and there's quite a lot of editorial, but none of it actually changes the section. So that's the proposal, that we go through that through the editorial process, rather than asking members to rather than asking John to make the changes between now and you know the end of the week, issuing that all to members and then having to walk all the way through that and then go through the final round of changes. So that's the reason for that proposal, if that's okay. Okay, so Ross, with that.
Ian, before the vote, could I just say that I'll be in a position to circulate the revised wording of that paragraph on a resource later today or early tomorrow.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful, John. Again, that gives members plenty of time to review and consider. Okay, so Ross, with that.
So with that, I'd like to now ask those members who would like to vote for approval of the ED 81, subject to the resource item being recirculated for Wednesday and the editorial process. So if you vote for, please virtually raise your hand. And I've got 16 hands raised, 17 hands raised. So 17 votes for. You can take down your hands. We have one absent, Hervé Metzger. So that gives us 18 votes. So I'll just ask everyone to take their hands down, please.
Okay. So with that, we've given approval subject to that definition coming back next week and the editorial process. And in terms of the editorial process, if you wish to be part of that group, please let John know.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay. John, I think anything else you need at this stage?
No, nothing from me. Just to thank my colleagues on IPSASB, particularly Joe, Joao, Vanessa, and the help I've had from members and technical advisors and their colleagues, without going into detail, which has been immensely helpful, and without which I don't think I would have been able to have brought material for this meeting. So thank you all.
Okay, so thanks everyone, and I think moving to approval in that way actually will help us, because clearly as we move into the next item on natural resources, that's all about the asset side of things, and assets and liabilities are both again relevant when we move into tomorrow's session on revenue and transfer expenses. So that's really important. Mike.
Sorry, Chair, it just occurred to me, have we agreed on an exposure period?
No, we haven't. No. That's a good point.
And as we think about it, John, and maybe we also need to think about other documents being put up for exposure at this meeting.
Yeah.
Can I go to Ross on that one,
yeah.
John?
Yeah, sure.
So I think the exposure period should be 4 months. That's our normal exposure period. Again, we have one other exposure draft we'll be looking to approve as well, retirement benefit plans. Both of them are relatively minor compared to our bigger projects, and it's highly likely they'll be a little bit staggered in the publication dates when we think about the finalization process, so they won't completely overlap. I would expect a half a month to a month difference in their publication dates once we work through the editorial process. So I don't see any reason why we would go longer than our normal 4 months for either of these. And I should note that we have no other ongoing exposures at the moment.
Ross and Ian, I think Mike's point was on the spacing of the two EDs. And
well, can we just sort out this one, please?
All right. Okay.
So I think the proposal, there's no specific reason why we should go against the normal default of 4 months for this one. So if we can agree on that one, for this document, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks for that reminder, Mike. So I think with that we have completed on this, and then we'll see the definition back next week, or in advance of next week, just for final consideration. So we now move on to natural resources, and here we obviously have a number of updates that have been made to the draft consultation paper as a result of the very good discussions we had at the last meeting. And we're not seeking to approve at this meeting, but I think what we're really looking for in terms of the discussion is to make sure that with the reflection of the thinking and the discussion from last time's meeting, that we've now effectively landed in the right place, if I can say that, in terms of the discussion. And we can clearly then, as a result of what we're going to do today, then there will be tightening up. But essentially, what we want to make sure is that we've now got the right material, and that we've now got the right sort of conclusions in the paper. With those observations, Lindy, I might just, before moving to Edwin to introduce the item, Lindy, as Task Force Chair, are there any comments that you want to make at this stage?
Thanks, Chair. Not anything in particular. I think Edwin will take us through the issues, but just to say thank you to staff, both present and past, for all the work they put into this. I think it is a lot to have to look at this and think about how we address board comments, and I think we're getting there. I think maybe we're there at this meeting, but hopefully we're a lot closer and have addressed your concerns. And thanks to the task force as well for assistance. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much to task force members. I think that's been a very, very important part of this project, and a lot of excellent input as well as from the board. Clearly it's going to be a high profile project, so I think this is very much moving us in the right direction. Okay, so with that, Edwin, over to you to introduce the item. Welcome.
Thanks, Ian. Let me just share my slides. So as Lindy has said, we have made a lot of progress, and there we go. And I'll just start by going through overall introduction for the session. So we're planning to walk through some of the key changes that were made to the consultation paper. The first section, we're talking about an update to the general description and also the concept of human intervention. And this was in response to some of the instructions from the September meeting. And then we're going to walk through chapters 6, 5, and 4 in that order. And the next issue is one other significant change to the CP. And then finally, I want to spend some time on next steps, and to just remind members that the plan is to finalize the CP in the next meeting in March 2022 and have a publication date targeted for April of 2022. So in terms of the first issue, so we received instructions in September on really questioning whether we need the criteria for a natural resource to be in its natural state. And related to that, we were asked to clarify the concept of human intervention and how that relates to control, or if it relates to control. And we were also asked to have better signposting in chapter 1 of the CP to talk about, what are we actually talking about here? What's in scope versus out of scope? So you'll notice that in the draft chapter 1, we have actually made a lot of significant changes. But the one key change that we have made is we've added figure 1, which is kind of a roadmap for the entire project as I see it. And I'm just going to walk through that diagram now, just so that members understand how we came up with this, I guess, pictorial representation of what our project is about. So firstly, our thinking was, well, this project is really dealing with natural resources and whether they can be recognized in the general purpose financial statements. And when we think about natural resources, the first question is really, well, is the resource still in its natural state? Because we think that if it is, then these items would be within the scope of this project, versus if it is not, it is very likely that the resource is already covered by an existing IPSASB. So on the slide here, what we've tried to show is that, if the resource is in its natural state, it's in the top half of this diagram. Whereas if it's already subject to human intervention or no longer in its natural state, it would likely be covered by existing IPSASB on intangible assets, inventory, PP&E, and agriculture. And the one thing we wanted to raise as well is that for this specific project, we're only dealing with tangible natural resources. So that's why we've separated this box into the two halves. The left half on intangible assets is out of scope for this project. And there is a potential project on intangible assets that's coming up that has been in the mid-period review. And that might cover natural intangible assets as well when we get to that. So that is really the reason why we need the question of, is the resource in its natural state? It doesn't really have anything to do with control or whether it's an asset. It's really a scoping issue to say, yes, these resources are within the scope of the CP. And if it's no longer in its natural state, then it's already covered by an existing IPSASB. So, so the next question is, well, if it's a resource that's a natural resource, should it be recognized in the general purpose financial statements, or is this something that cannot be recognized and should be outside, perhaps in a broader general purpose financial report? And that question really depends on whether the item meets the definition of an asset. And when we think about that, we have to think about existence uncertainty and whether that item is measurable. And also we have to consider measurement uncertainty when we think about measurability. And in the definition of an asset, that's where we consider control. So again, control and human intervention are totally unrelated. And we try to show that on this diagram because, well, the way we try to show in this diagram is the human intervention question is represented by the horizontal orange line, whereas the question on meeting the definition of an asset, which includes control, is in the vertical purple line. Okay. And if an item is not in, does not meet the recognition criteria, we're not saying that we're going to ignore it for this project. What we have landed on, and it's discussed more fully in the disclosure section, is that we think that there should be some type of disclosure or discussion in the broader general purpose financial reports. And the way we have landed on that is that the IPSASB already have recommended practice guidelines 1, 2, and 3 on long-term fiscal sustainability, financial statement discussion and analysis, and also service performance reporting. So to the extent that natural resources, whether they're recognized or unrecognized, relate to or are relevant to those 3 topics, we think that they should be discussed in some form in the broader general purpose financial reports. And we're also saying that in the future, there could be potential guidance that we might be releasing. So we're not closing the door on that at this stage. We're saying that for now, we're only focusing on RPGs 1, 2, and 3 because that's what's already out. But we very well might have additional guidance on this in the future. So that was a quick overview of this diagram. And I guess before I get into the actual bullet points, I'll just open it up to the board to see, to get any reactions and comments. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Edwin. And of course, it was also reacting to the concern that members had about trying to present the overall scope of the project using a flowchart, which appeared to narrow us down very much. So this was trying to give the entire landscape. And I think one of the things, the challenges is actually that presentation works very well as a PowerPoint. It's harder to convey, you know, on paper. But anyway, just take reactions on that. And Lindy, perhaps to you first, and then I'll go to Adrienne.
Thank you very much. And I think maybe just also to make it clear that, I mean, when we talk about the scope of the project, this is what we are exploring. It might not be what would be in a final standard. And I wonder if that's something, we've got it there, but maybe we need to make it a bit stronger, because even when we were discussing it here, this is what we are discussing. How it might land up or translate into a standard on its own or updates to standards, we don't know yet. And I think maybe that might help as well. Because I think we started this with a standard, but actually now we're actually just exploring topics, not actually exploring a standard. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes the word scope might cause a confusion, but that's something, I mean, that's editorial, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Lindy. I think that's a useful piece of communication, and I saw support for you know, that change, because I think we are doing that exploration at the moment. We're not necessarily saying what the outputs would be. Okay, so probably in terms of, I'll take member comments first, and then I'll go to you, Thomas. So at the moment, I've got Todd and then Adrienne.
Thanks, Ian, and well done to the task force and to staff on where they've got to on this CP. I think it's looking really good at this stage. But getting to the figure 1, I must admit I found it very confusing when I was reading this the papers for this meeting. And it was helpful for you to go through the explanation that you did, but I am a bit concerned that it's trying to do too much in this visual, and I think it's going to be lost on our constituents. And I wonder whether we need to find a way to simplify the visual, or even have maybe a couple of visuals and keep them very simple and make sure that we're conveying the right messages to the constituents in the visual, because certainly the description that you've just given us does not come through from just the visual. So I would be concerned if we put the CP out with this as it is now. I think it does require a bit of work to make sure that we do hit the mark with our constituents.
Thanks, Todd. I think, you know, probably maybe we should instruct staff to look at, maybe we might use the visual a couple of different times to support the discussion in the text, so that you could see the build up actually in. So if we sort of suggest that maybe staff does that, and there might also be, I think perhaps we could improve the presentation of the diagram, and you know, in terms of use of some different colours and so on, again with that communication point in mind, and try and approach it in that way. So we can have those two things for staff to consider. I've got Adrienne, Camira and Mike.
So I'm really reiterating what Todd said, that Edwin's very, very clear in his thinking, and it comes across well in the PowerPoint, but it gets lost in the diagram. So I'm happy that Ian is instructing staff to go away and think about the diagram. I somehow, for me, a Venn diagram approach where you show the overlap and the interlinkages, but it's not in a square, and you have more scope for different colors, would be a clearer signal. So I'm hoping that they might look at that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adrienne. Ross, you put your hand up. Was there something you wanted to just come in on quickly before I move to Camira?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm kind of wondering, what I'm hearing is, and what I've heard a couple times now, is that Edwin's explanation and how he showed the diagram build up was helpful. I wonder if we can't take it away in the text, and as we move through the narrative, make sure we've got the points that Edwin just made clearly and show the diagram how it builds, and then have the end result, the final diagram, instead of just putting the end in there with a big block of text. I'm a little bit hesitant to go another route, like a Venn diagram or something else, because I kind of wonder if we'll end up in the same place of, you know, the same issue where people aren't understanding how it comes together. So I think if there's narrative points that aren't there supporting the diagram, we can fix that, but we can also break up what's already there and show it. I think visually we can improve it, but I think I'm not sure we're going to get anything that captures the thinking any more clearly if we go a different direction.
I don't think anybody, I mean, I saw support when you were describing that approach, Ross, that we build it up and we make sure that the text links with the build up, essentially along the lines of the key points in Edwin's presentation, so that, you know, basically we take our constituents through the story. And then I think, to Adrienne's point, we not only build it and make sure it ties together through that introductory section, but I think we also look at the visual side and see if we can make some more differentiation on the color rather than it all being in blue, which would again help people to follow that story. So I think that's the way we should go forward and try that. You know, because I think it was trying to show the whole thing, and actually it shows why it's been so tricky, because there are so many different dimensions to this. So if we go that route, I think that's the one on that. Next to Camira and then to Mike, and then I'll take Thomas at that stage.
Thanks, Chair, and apologize for before I had the internet connections. I agree with Todd's comment and what has been discussed as of now. The diagram that could be a bit has too much information and it's difficult to understand, especially the legend. When we are mentioning the legend, the dark blue color, that is the scope of the National Resources consultation paper. We have in the diagram also that is covered by this dark blue color, those resources that are not in their natural state. I would think that that is outside the scope. And then why is it in the diagram also highlighted with dark blue? So that's why I think we need to improve a bit the diagram to make it clearer. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Camilla, and that specific point. So I'll go to Mike and then to Thomas.
Oh, thank you, Chair. So I was going to raise the same issue as Camilla has, but I also had one just word of caution. All the studies that I've been doing on the climate change stuff in New Zealand is a good example, is about getting the corporates in New Zealand to report climate change risk rather than climate change per se. So just don't manage expectations. I think it's accounting for climate change impacts, but it's not climate change itself.
Thanks, Mike. And I think perhaps on that, we should just cross-check and make sure it links in with the title of the prototype guidance that's been issued or published for the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. That would help with that link. Okay, so then to Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Actually, I wanted to be a little bit more positive on the diagram, to be honest, because I thought it was a very good approach, and certainly I think the build-up approach as described by Ross, linking the text could even help improving the understanding. It was exactly addressing the 2 points of concern the CAG had, kind of clearly didn't put the delineation out between what is remaining in natural state versus subject to human intervention on one side, and where's the borderline to other standards. So for me, I thought it was very well addressing the points. Everybody knows that I'm visual, and therefore I'm very thankful to Task Force and staff for doing that. And I think, as Ross described, it would even improve it. So I would encourage using it further. It really helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I must admit, I certainly had you in mind on this one. So maybe we have the Thomas test going forwards in terms of. Okay, thanks. Adrienne, you want to come in again?
Yes, please. It's in response to Mike's point, which I think is a very good one. I think we would lose nothing by changing e.g. climate change to e.g. climate change risks, because it would convey a lot of information to public sector entities at the moment, and it wouldn't rule out any other EGs. I think that's where the work is at the moment on risks, and it would be good to signal that we're on it, even if it'll take a while.
Yeah, okay, all right, thanks for that. And I see thumbs up supporting that. So we make that change to refer to risks. Okay, so thanks very much for that, everyone. So we have those instructions in terms of building the diagram up, making sure the text ties in with it to tell the story, thinking further about use of color and so on to make sure that takes people through the story, both visually and text-wise. Okay, so with that, Edwin, if we can move back into your presentation.
Okay. Okay, so this next slide is, I guess, the first few bullets is already what we've talked about. So the task force is recommending that we retain the requirement for a natural resource to be in its natural state, and also the concept of human intervention for scoping purposes, as we've discussed. And also, as we've talked about in the diagram, we have shown the difference between human intervention and control. The one additional point I wanted to raise is we have added SMC1 in Chapter 1 to ask for constituents' views on whether the distinction between resources in and out of their natural state is useful. And we've also asked constituents whether they foresee any challenges in applying the general description of natural resources. So I'll stop here and get reactions from the board.
So in terms of discussion, perhaps we might look at SMC1 and just get members' reactions on that. And then I'd suggest we go to the documents that you've very helpfully marked up with the, the yellow, Edwin, and just walk through chapter 1. Okay, so Mike, you are on SMC1, first of all.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Edwin. So I'm okay with the way it's been worded. I just questioned why we called it a specific matter for consideration, not for comment. That's the first time we changed that word, and it's in the ED itself. I just wanted to check, or CP itself.
Edwin?
That might be a typo. I'll change it back to comment.
Yeah, I think if you can, because we don't want people getting confused on this, so we use specific matter for comments. So if you can change the title and just make that change. Thomas.
Yeah, I was looking at SMC1 in context with the PV1, and I already had in mind sitting there and trying to answer and drafting the comment letter. So I'm just not sure whether this is kind of a duplication, because I wouldn't know what I should write differently in PV1 and SMC1. Probably I would already raise the concerns if I would have concerns at PV1. So not that much new in SMC1. Just to clarify that.
So looking at that, Thomas, I can understand that. When I read that, I thought my impression based on the discussions that the board had was actually that SMC1 was specifically, was almost the real question, was that last, was the third part. And that was what we were really getting feedback on. Lindy, do you want to just fill us in on the discussions and the thinking before I go back to Edwin?
I was actually wondering if it should maybe come after the discussion of the diagram, because that's where really the importance of the bright line or the orange line comes in, so that we don't get people confused. So you kind of have, this is the description, then we have the discussion, which shows you why the orange line is so important, and then ask a question. I don't know if that would help, Thomas.
I think it's probably Thomas's point was actually, yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, we need to think about what's the board's view and then what we're asking questions around. And certainly my impression from the debate we've had thus far was it was about the practical application of that in its natural state, which was the concern that members were referring to. Edwin, just to you on this. I agree with you, Lindy. There may be a sort of positioning thing that we need to have a think about when we, when Edwin's worked through the section with the build-up of the diagram and making sure the text ties in. Edwin, to you.
Yeah, I think the SMC, as Lindy said, was really meant to go with the diagram. So it's more about whether the scoping part or the orange line makes sense. So whereas the PV is really just asking about, the description on its own. So I can certainly work on clarifying that the SMC is really just on, do you agree that human intervention is the right way to scope the standard or to scope the CP?
Okay, thanks. I think if you do that, that will help. I've got two flags up at the moment, so Patricia and then Lynn.
Yes, thank you. I think we have to be careful about the question, because this is the fundamental for other SMCs, other preliminary views. When I ask the constituents or respondents about it, you agree with the limitation or threshold and separate the natural research is in natural state. It's fundamental to ask other questions for other preliminary views. I think it will be careful about this and then ask, okay, if you disagree, what is consequence for other steps in the because if the respondents disagree, we need to think about other model, other ways to solve to address the issue about the natural resource. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So probably we need to reorient that perhaps more towards what practical issues would you see in, or what would need to be addressed in IPSASB's guidance or something like that, so that the preliminary view is the kind of the actual description and getting feedback on that, and then this becomes more about how you would operationalize that. Is that a reasonable way to look at your comment?
Sorry. Yeah, I think, in fact, in this state, we need to know about the think, how the respondents think. But I think it's important to indicate that if disagree with some assumptions that assumptions that we have, the model needs to be completely different. Because this, I think, we need to be careful how to ask the constituent and indicate if, for example, it's not possible in this moment, or in accordance with the conceptual framework, include other measurement bases, or, for example, because I think maybe some respondents could say for us, use the opportunity cost for it's a base using the economic literature, but it's not possible based on the conceptual framework. I think it's important to indicate it. This is fundamental. It's essential to for the other preliminary views. If you indicate that it's not agree with this assumption, because it's an assumption, you need to please consider other consequences in other chapters and other. Yes, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Patricia. Lynn.
Thanks. So my comment was on SMC1, and clearly work's gone into the CP following the last discussion to clarify what we mean by human intervention. And I think that the last sentence on paragraph 1.8, where we say activities to preserve or conserve natural resources rather than modifying them, is not considered to be human intervention. I think we need that sentence somewhere in SMC1, because we are defining human intervention not in plain English. We are defining it in this sort of modification to the quantity or quality, and that had caused us a bit of debate about what we really meant by that. So we've got the extra sentence now in para 1.8 to explain what we don't mean by it, and I think it would be helpful to include that in SMC1.
Thanks, Lynn. Ross, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, on this point, and I think Patricia's point and where it's going, I think if we step back, the reason we have an SMC here is because earlier in debates, I think we had a bit of a split in the board on how helpful human intervention was and how it was working. So we weren't comfortable putting it as a PV or part of the PV because there clearly wasn't clear support in the board. But I think as we've evolved the drafting, I think that's bringing the board together. And I would say we're probably trending more towards, I think this is maybe where Patricia's thinking was taking me, that this is a PV around human intervention and the scope of the CP and how our guidance works. So I wonder if maybe that doesn't help if we don't make it an open-ended question and we say this is the board's view, and how it views our range of guidance and this topic and where it fits. And I think that gets us away from kind of asking an open question that there might not be an answer to, for example, on how we're going to fit these things in. So I would encourage consideration of whether it should be part of the PV that's there or a separate PV. And then we can pick up the clarification points. I think the one Lynn just made is very helpful. That is one of the key changes we've made to human intervention that I think is helping bring everyone together. So I think it's around the nuancing, but I just wanted to make that point because there was a specific reason it was an SMC and not a PV previously.
So just before we get into the next round of comments, the human intervention point is actually what underlies is in its natural state. And I think, Lynn's point was actually very helpful in getting us into this, because I think, we've proposed that, conservation expenditure is not part of human intervention. So I think there's no doubt that we would need an SMC, which is on the practical, what further guidance, what issues would the board need to consider in assessing human intervention and expenditure, perhaps. So that's the sort of, if you like, we're asking a question about what would you need in the guidance to help you do this. Then I think the question, to your point, Ross, is do we need to specifically ask a separate PV at this stage or not? So I'll just, with that thought at this point in the discussion, go back to Patricia. Mike, I think you were okay with that. You put your hand down. Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. My question here is, the SMEC asked if the distinction is useful, and my question is, I ask if it's useful as a wall. I think it's complicated because it's the base for other PVs. My question is the way how we will ask the respondents, because if the respondents say no, it's not useful, then our PVs is not useful too. It is my point.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's why we're having a discussion about the distinction between preliminary view, because if you look at preliminary view 1, it says, do you agree with that description? If not, please provide your reasons. So I think that's where you would get the feedback from. And then the idea behind the SMC then is that we reorient that much more towards the more practical thing, that in operationalizing that, what guidance would, what issues would need to be covered, and how would we help, and the difference between human intervention and conservation. Ross, just back to you on process then, because I think there was a bit of a process point behind what Patricia was saying. How would we normally handle PVs versus SMCs?
Well, a PV is meant to be the board's view, where this is what we think, and then do you agree, disagree? An SMC, as you described, like if we wanted feedback on the type of guidance we might propose, but we haven't necessarily come to a view on what that might look like, that's where you'd ask more of the open-ended questions.
So I think in terms of taking this forward, I mean, I think, I don't want to debate this much further at this stage. I think what we've got at the moment is we've got the PV, which is specifically on the description, and that proposes the way the board sees going forwards. The SMC needs to be angled towards what guidance, how would we address it, and clearly we need to, that needs to be thought through in that space. I'll take comments from Renee and then Lindy as chair, and then I'll move us on to consideration of the text in the chapter. So Renee.
Thank you, Chair. Just reacting to what Ross said, which I think was useful, the difference between a PV and an SMC. I think we started maybe with an SMC earlier in our thinking because we were still struggling. And however, I think that as of now, our view, our preliminary view, including the edits to paragraph 1.8, is becoming a lot clearer. And I think an earlier version of the PV, it had more in it. I think the PV had paragraph 1.8 in it. So maybe if we go back and just have the PV, clearly state our view, including 1.8, then maybe we don't need the SMC. So just reacting to how Ross explained the difference, and I think we've evolved over the last couple meetings too.
Okay, thanks, Renee. And I think that's helpful, actually, you know, because this is about actually getting to the stage where we as a board do have a view, and clearly we have moved forward on this. So I think probably what we need to instruct staff and the task force then is to go back and have another look at that PV1 along the lines that Renee has just suggested. When you've done that, link to that, I think the question then is actually, do we now need an SMC at this stage? So I think that's the thinking that we need. And if we do, how do we angle that to make sure that constituents are sure about, it clarifies we're looking for one thing here, which is your views on our proposed way forward. If we have the SMC, actually, that's much more about what sort of guidance, how do we operationalize, how would you, what would you need from us to operationalize that? Okay. That's good. So I think that's been a helpful discussion then. So what I'd suggest is actually we probably just walk through the section again. I think we're getting quite familiar with this now, but it is a very important orientation section. So I just want to get comments on chapter 1. We've got the page 12, you've got those 3 introductory paragraphs now, Edwin, that have gone in 1.1 to 1.3. Just want to pick up any comments from board members on those. Yes, David, and then Todd.
Thank you, Ian. I know some meetings ago we actually instructed staff and the task force to streamline chapter 1, the introductory chapter, quite significantly. I'm just wondering whether we actually streamlined it slightly too much, because it seems to go straight into it without really telling constituents why we're doing it. And I think there's a little bit in Appendix A and sort of the very early paragraphs that just could be perhaps precede slightly and just slotted into chapter 1 to give a feel for why we're doing it.
Okay, thanks for that comment, David. And I saw thumbs up from Todd and Adrienne. So I think this is a balance that we need to strike, because we don't want to get all of that stuff back in. But I think if we could perhaps add, maybe a couple of bullet points that gave the headlines from the appendix that just give you that, here's the high level why we're doing this. Okay, so if we have that as an instruction, thanks for that confirmation, Adrienne. So I've got Todd, then Mike.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, I had the same point to raise as David had, and I'd also given a little bit of thought to the key matters that I'd like to see in paragraph 1.3 that are sitting in the appendix. And I think it's around the significance of natural resources across many jurisdictions. I think it's around the growing public concern about sustainable management of the natural environment, as well as then dealing with the more practical, recognition, measurement, and presentation of these things. So I have actually got some marked up wording. I think would be helpful to send that through to staff, perhaps as a starter, to think about what we need in that introductory section.
Thanks, Todd. I think that would be helpful, and I saw thumbs up. I think you'd hit the right issues there, and it's some succinct drafting that just set that context and then referred into the more detailed discussion. I think would create that bridge nicely. Okay, so if you can pass that over to Edwin, that would be really helpful. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with what's been said. I just had two questions. We only get to to paragraph 1.7 when we conclude that the focus is going to be on subsoil, water, and living. And I wonder whether we shouldn't have made that conclusion earlier. It's okay, but I just was sort of expecting to see it stated much sooner. And then I just had a question on 1.6 where we provide as an example seismic activity. And I agree it's unlikely to be a resource. I don't know how it could be a resource ever. So I wasn't sure it was the best example I could think of to come up with, but it's not wrong. It just seemed an odd one to be using because it's never going to be a resource.
Okay, thanks for that point, Mike. So I think the instruction is just consider whether that paragraph 1.7 should be positioned up at the top. And I think that again comes back to how we tell the narrative in this section. So I think that's a consideration there. Edwin, did you want to pick up that other question from Mike?
Yeah, so we added the seismic activity to show that there are some natural phenomena which will never be resources. So that was the intention. And the reason why we did that is because if we, thinking back to the diagram, we were kind of zooming into what a natural resource is. So we started at the very, very top level where everything is some sort of natural phenomena. And is this something that we can leverage as a resource? Well, there are some things that can never be a resource. So that's what this paragraph is meant to capture.
Okay, thanks. I see thumbs up from Mike on that. Okay, so I've got Mary and then Adrienne.
Thank you. I would like to confirm about the 1.8. It is very important to describe the human intervention. And my question is, the activities to preserve or conserve natural resources to retain natural state is also not considered as human intervention, and it relates the natural state and the relationship between the natural state.
Sorry, Mary, I think we lost you, but I think we had the sense of it's that 1.8, whether there's any additional explanation required there. Edwin, do you just want to comment on that? Because clearly work has been done on that in the task force.
Yeah, so I actually got a different drafting comment on that. And and I think this relates to Mari's point, but we were given a suggestion to perhaps say that conservation activities generally are not considered human intervention because you have to look at the specific facts and circumstances of whatever the activity is to conclude whether it is. So I think if I'm getting Mari's point correctly, I think that will also address her point to be not too categorical and saying, no, it's never a human intervention.
Okay. Perhaps on that, Mary, if that's okay, if there's anything else, if you can drop Edwin an email just to clarify on that.
Yes, thank you. I'm confused with the definition of the human intervention, and it relates to how to measure the natural resources to maybe the
I mean, I think that. Thanks. Sorry to cut over you. So I think it does come back to that practical issue, doesn't it, in terms of how would you make that differentiation? So I think, Edwin, if you can have just a bit more thought about that, and again, that probably links to whether we have an SMC or, you know, that is kind of the kind of key area, I think. Adrienne, then Scott, and then I'll move us on to the next section.
So the comment on I think someone mentioned paragraph 6, but I think they were actually talking about paragraph 7. I wouldn't want paragraph 7 to be moved up too high up in the introduction, because I think the elegance of this introduction is it's general, and it addresses all the conceptual issues about defining natural resources. And then we say, in phase 1 of this project, we're going to deal with subsoil and living resources and water. And so moving the introduction of subsoil, living resources and water right up to the front, I think would disappoint people. They would, this is my general theme all along, that we have to look as if we're stepping up to the plate and addressing the whole issue. And we don't want to undermine it by saying we're not ready to grapple with this, we're only going to look at subsoil. And I think the paper does a really good job of that. So don't undermine it by making it too specific at the beginning of the introduction. I think it's fine where it is, and I'd like to leave it there, please.
Thanks, Adrienne. I think I saw a thumbs up from Mike to that. I certainly saw thumbs up from other members. And I think, I think that's a very helpful way of looking at it, that it sets it up very generally and then we tie it down more specifically. And it's much more an operational issue, if you like, in terms of how we're exploring the concept. So it might even move down. It certainly shouldn't move up. That's okay. Scott, final point from you.
Thank you, Ian. I'm talking about paragraph 1.9, and at first I thought it was an editorial comment, but the more I thought about it, it's more of a question to the task force. It's the word existing in the last sentence, and it appeared in the diagram too, so that's the reason I'm bringing it up. When I viewed the diagram, yes, we know the standards we currently have issued that are outside of natural resources, but we don't know future. And I'm wondering whether we should limit it to existing or just to give a bit bigger picture. Is it in the future, we may actually issue other standards that fit below the line. And right now we've sort of limited it to above, this is what we got. So again, I think it's more than editorial. I think it's maybe a communication on this.
Yes, I think that's a good point, Scott. So we might want to specifically say, in another existing IPSASB pronouncement or possible future or something like that. That's not very elegant, but I think then that would tie in with the diagram as well. So Edwin, if you can take that away, and we need that formulation that makes that difference between what's already there and what might come in the future. Okay, so just to check, are there any other comments on 1.6 through 1.9? No, okay, so we talked about the SMC. We're then into project scope, which is 110 through to 116, which is the lead into the diagram as it is at the moment. And then we've just got the tail at the end, 117 through to 119 in terms of structure of the remaining sections. Okay, so thanks very much to everyone. I think that shows that section 1 has really improved very significantly. We now need to think about the communication and so on, and we've given instructions on that. Adrienne, final comment. You're between us and the break, though.
It may just be a communication issue. I think, and I don't know whether you can do this or not, but I think in paragraph 114, having a direct link to the Q&A would be really valuable, because paragraph 14 as it stands, you don't know what the Q&A cover, but on the other hand, the Q&A is very helpful in addressing the issues. So I don't know if you can put in a direct link, but it would be a place where a direct link would be really valuable. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrienne. I think that's a neat suggestion. We can take that forward. Good. Okay, so with that final instruction there, I think we take a break until 1:45, and then we come back and we'll start to look at the section on presentation. Okay, thanks everyone.
1:45.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Good. Okay. Just give members another sort of few seconds to come back into the meeting. Okay. So, Edwin, lead us into the discussion about, the final chapter on presentation. Clearly, this is the one that we've had, we've only really had one go at, but it does actually cover some really important material. I think you've made some very good progress on this. So perhaps if you can lead us into the discussion.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, so as Ian said, we're moving on to the presentation chapter, and these changes were brought about in response to the instructions from the board in September. So the first one was the suggestion to add in proposed objectives of disclosure, and we did that in paragraph 6.10 of the CP. And before I get into or open it up for the board for reaction, I did get a comment on whether the wording of the first objective made a lot of sense. And what the first objective currently says is that it's to require entities to disclose the nature, amount, and uncertainty and timing of cash flows related to natural resources. And why it's awkward is because the second objective is to talk about the impact of natural resources on the entity's financial position, financial performance, and cash flows. So it kind of feels a little bit duplicative. And I just want to provide the background of how we came up with those objectives. And we looked to ED 70, and also back then it would have been the ED or the draft standard on leases. And we really lifted the wording from IFRS 15 and 16. But after getting the comment, I was reflecting that if we were to look back to other IPSAS or other IFRSs, such as the standards on financial instruments, consolidation, and then if we were to look at IFRS 17, the normal wording is really just to talk about the nature and extent of risks associated with the item. So my suggestion would be to amend the first objective to say that entities are required to disclose the nature and extent of risk associated with natural resources, rather than the wording that's in the CP right now. So I'll pause here and open it up for the board to discuss.
Okay. Thanks, Edwin, for that explanation and the proposed change. Anybody have any comments on that? Yeah, Lynn.
Can I just clarify what you're saying then? You're not talking about risks in relation to cash flows, you're talking about risk more generally? Because I guess my comment on this chapter was there was a lot of emphasis on cash flows rather than, say, service potential. So I just want to be clear what we're saying.
Yes, so there'll still be two objectives. The first one is on general risk. So it's really just more qualitative. And then the second objective is to talk about, the impact on the balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow. So that's where we would talk about specifically the cash flow impact. But for the first objective, it's really more a generic discussion of risks.
Lynn, back on that.
And so I think it would be helpful to see the wording, because I think normally in the public sector, we talk about cash flow and service potential. And I just wonder how we're getting service potential built into it, if at all.
Edwin?
Yeah, I can work that in. That the service potential point, I think, might be more appropriate to include in the second objective, because the first one is really a high-level discussion of the qualitative risks, whereas the second one is more focused on, I would say, the numerical aspects, so the service potential and the economic benefits and how that works into the financial statements.
I mean, I'm wondering, just sort of listening to the discussion, whether, and this perhaps goes to the ordering and so on, whether that what's currently the second objective isn't really the first objective, and then actually the discussion, when you focus it on risks, okay, some of that would relate to general purpose financial statements, but it certainly relates into general purpose financial reports, and that might make a bit more sense in terms of taking them that way around. Adrian, are you on this as well?
Yes, I think my point is the same as Len's, although I was coming at it from another angle. I wouldn't like us to give the impression that everything is about risks, because there is also the value of the portfolio of resources, and so risk is the next step, and it maybe what you're saying about reordering the objectives would make that clear. But what I wouldn't like is for despite my earlier comment, I wouldn't like us to switch gear and say everything is about climate risk, because our whole point is the government is different, and the government is the custodian as well as you know, the investor and the entity with financial risk. Thank you. I think the suggestions that you're saying would address that, but certainly not to switch everything so it's only about risk.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Adrian. And there's always that issue when you talk about risk that it actually refers to both up and downside. Okay, and then if I can go to Renee next, please.
Yes, just building on Adrian's point, thank you, Chair. I totally agree with her. And what I've seen in the sustainability literature so far, it's risks and opportunities. I've seen that term used, and I think it's like the negative and the positive, and I think that's Adrian's point. So maybe we want to pick up that approach in our drafting.
Okay, thanks for that. So I think that's given you a sense, Edwin, of the sort of thinking, if you like, that needs we just need to take back into that, you know, consideration of the objectives. And I think also just think, you know, because we talk later on about general purpose financial statements and then general purpose financial reports, and in a way, actually, if we angle one more particularly, the first one more particularly, to the kind of conventional general purpose financial statements, and then talk about risks and opportunities, that starts to get you into that broader landscape. So have a think about how that works with the rest. Okay, so move us on then.
Okay, so the next significant change is we've reorganized pretty much the entire chapter so that we have now broken out the disclosures and information to be presented into three broad buckets. The first one is information that is typically disclosed in the general purpose financial statements, and that's information relating to recognized natural resource assets. We also have another group of disclosure items in the financial statements for unrecognized natural resources. And then finally, for all natural resources that are relevant to RPGs 1, 2, and 3, we're proposing the display of, or the disclosure of information in the broader general purpose financial reports. At this point, I'll pause and get reactions on how we've broken out the items, but I think we'll probably need to do a page flip after just to make sure everything's in the right place. So I'll pause here.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So on the overall approach taken, any comments on that from members? Okay, so shall we move then into the just walking through page by page the presentation section. So if we take the first part of that, which is 6.1 through to 6.5. And then 6.6 through 6.9. Then 6.10 through 6.14. Then 6.15 through 6.21. Uh, 6.22 through to, let's just do 6.22 and 6.23, and then I'd like to pause on the preliminary view. So let's focus on the preliminary view at this stage. Any comments on that? Okay, so that's PV10. Then we have another specific matter for comment. Okay, so I think members are very happy with the way that this section has been developed. Edwin, from your perspective, before we move off it, is there anything else that you feel we need to cover on this?
The only other thing I was going to cover was for SMC2. I know we got no comments, but what the task force intended to ask is whether the RPGs 1, 2, and 3 should be mandatory for information related to natural resources. And I don't know if that's really going too far in this project, so I wanted to confirm that the board is really okay with us asking the question.
Adrienne.
So I think it's perfect to ask the question. I mean, it's an open-ended question. We really need feedback on how bad would it be, and it would be so interesting to read the responses. So I very much welcome the question, and I really welcome the way the whole chapter was developed. I think Edwin's done a spectacular job in pulling together the information that would be valuable. So let's get feedback on whether we're asking too much and whether it's too hard. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Adrienne. So in terms of member comments, I'll take Mike and then go to Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. And I support Adrienne, but I'm just wondering how that's going to work. If the RPG itself is not mandatory, how can we then have a component therein that is mandatory? Just explain how that's going to work.
Okay. I'm going to collect comments, and then perhaps Ross, I might go to you on a process point at this stage. So Lindy and then Thomas.
Yeah, maybe Ross will answer it, but I think we just need to make it clear we want to know, but that would have to be a separate project that the board would have to consider and take on, because I don't think we could actually, through this, deal with a RPG. So I think we might have to just add a little bit more context to what we would do with the responses.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. So I'll go to Thomas and then to Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to mention that obviously in June 2021, the CAG also discussed the presentation and especially the disclosure item and issue. I think there was both kind of voices kind of requesting sufficient information, especially around the question of some items which fulfill the asset definition, but are not recognized because of measurement uncertainties. What were the reasons? I think that was one part of the voices. The other was a kind of warning of an information overload. And I think as it is drafted at the moment, I think for me, it seems to be very, very balanced and handling both parts of the warnings. And therefore, I thought, just to echo what Adrienne said, I think Edwin did a fantastic job to kind of, on one side, put the finger on the relevant issues, but on the other side, not being too overextensive. Regarding the RPGs, I think we still have the issue of an information overload, but I think it's the right approach to ask. So let's see what constituents are saying regarding that.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So maybe go to you at this stage.
So on a process issue, I think it's a CP, so we have a lot of options. I think it's clear that we use the CP for our advantage, and we make clear why we're asking the question and what we plan to do with it at this time, and without committing. You know, I think it's clear that we need to be, it's not an ED. We're not making firm proposals, so we shouldn't raise expectations that we are going to update or not, but that we'll take the information we receive together with the responses to the CP, and we'll make a decision as we develop exposure drafts, what we may or may not change. So I think let's not be shy to use the CP for our advantage. That's really what it's for, to shape our future standards in this space.
Thanks, Ross. I mean, I think that's where we do have to be very careful about this, because the dividing line, you know, in terms of recommended practice guidelines and IPSAS is important from a compliance statement point of view. You know, when people assert compliance with IPSAS at the moment, that doesn't require them to assert compliance. They're not asserting compliance with the recommended practice guidelines. And I guess there's also a question as to, you know, in that respect, are we actually specifically looking at information in the general purpose financial statements? Because kind of that's basically what the dividing line is at the moment, that RPGs are in respect of general purpose financial reports, whereas general purpose IPSAS are in respect of general purpose financial statements. So there's quite a lot involved in that. Then I think there's also the context, which is around, you know, what might be our role in respect of sustainability reporting going forward. So there's quite a few different layers in this discussion, and I think you know, we probably there is some further thinking, although you know, I think we understand the aspirations here. I think there might be some further thinking in terms of how we ask this question, and certainly, as Lindy pointed out, for those sorts of reasons, we would have to expose the requirements anyway, because they would be then form part of an IPSAS. So I think we just need to think that through in terms of the formulation. I agree it's worth asking, it's worth raising the points, but I think we just need to think that through a little bit more carefully in terms of you know, whether we express any of those issues, you know. So I think we just have to be careful in asking this question, and you know, it might well be more helpful to say, in your view, given its importance, should the provision of natural resources relate, you know, so there's a kind of context for it and a kind of reasoning for it. So I think if we can, I think you're right to draw our attention to that, Edwin. I think we just need to reflect from a process point of view, have we asked the question in precisely the right way? And what will we do with the feedback that we get, bearing in mind all those various other things that I've just alluded to. And I'm not saying in any way that we shouldn't ask the question, but I'm just saying we have to be really careful in where this might take us. Mike.
Yeah, I think you explained that really well. I think that one of the risks for me is that all the other information already in the RPGs then becomes secondary. And I don't think we're saying that at all. We just got to make sure that is for some reason natural resources more important, and therefore that's why it's mandatory. So we need to take some care in how we draft it. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Scott, and then back to Ross.
Yeah, thank you. Back to your comment, Ian. If you look at the preliminary views, it's stuck at the end as if it's equal to everything else. So I don't think we've set it up right. I have no problem asking a question. I'm a sustainability zealot, so I love this. But keep in mind, as difficult as accrual information is, guys, this is really hard. Okay, so I think we ought to make a preliminary review, but also explain why we're asking it. You know, that it's a different context, but it is different context than the other things we've listed as preliminary review.
Okay, thanks for that, Scott. Ross, back to you.
And maybe just another thought. I think we might need to just have a placeholder here to revisit this once we have a little bit better idea strategically where we're going on sustainability as a whole. Because at the moment, I think that part of the discussion is kind of an open question, and maybe we're going to need some allusion to that more broader consideration. Without getting into all that now, I think that's kind of where the point's going. So maybe just to flag that this is something that maybe we can't land today, that we will have to come back, but we're going to have to say something on that broader sustainability public sector issue to frame what people might say here as well. I think maybe that's your point, Ian, and I think Scott's point. So as we're still figuring that aspect out, it's really challenging to land it now, but I think we will have to come back to this in March and have a more fulsome description of that.
Okay, so thanks everyone. So I think we hear the importance that is attached to this. I think we need to think through and probably explain actually the issues involved in specific terms along the sort of factors that I outlined, that would influence our thinking. And I think that would go to Scott's point and Mike's point there about setting it up in the right way. So we will need some additional text that sets that up. And as you say, Ross, then it will need to be set up in the context of where our thinking on the potential role for IPSASB in sustainability reporting sits. And I think, given the sort of thinking that I mentioned in the CAG the other day, that obviously our discussions on sustainability reporting have thus far, from a board perspective, been in camera. Actually, one of the challenges for us is to move that forward into the public arena during the first quarter or so of next year, and that would fit then with the timing for this. So we need to bring those together and dovetail that. And I think, going back to the diagram at the beginning, actually that says, that's really taking us back into the diagram, actually, that there are linkages here, and we need to make sure those are sort of explicit. Okay, so thanks very much for that, Edwin. I think a strong vote of confidence there from the board in terms of how you've developed this section with the support and input of the task force. Certainly when I read it personally, I was very pleased to see how it had developed. So well done on that. So I think then if we can move back into the chapters on water and living resources.
Thanks. So we're going to cover living resources first. And so at the September meeting, we had an instruction to clarify specifically for living resources, the interaction between existing IPSAS, such as agriculture, and what we're trying to do in the CP. And this kind of ties back to the delineation between resources in and of the natural state that we've talked about before. So the way the task force approached this was we took the same logic flow from the diagram that we've talked about from figure 1, and we've really just reorientated the questions so that now it's in a flowchart form. And for living resources, I guess the way we've done it is we've asked the question, well, for biological items in general, have these items been subjected to human intervention? And this is really another way of asking, is it still in its natural state? And if it's not in its natural state, then the item will most likely fall into an existing IPSAS. And what the specific standard that it goes to will really depend on the nature of the activities that were performed or the nature of human intervention. And for items that were not subjected to human intervention, the next question is, well, okay, so these items are living resources. So the next step is, do these living resources meet the definition of an asset? And are they measurable? And if they are, then we can recognize them in the financial statements. And so in addition to just recognition, there are also disclosures, as we've talked about, for recognized living resource assets. And then there are also potential discussions in the broader general purpose financial reports. If it doesn't meet the recognition criteria, then it's just an unrecognized living resource. There still are some disclosures in the financial statements that we've proposed in Chapter 6, but for the most part, the bulk of the information will be part of the discussion in the broader general purpose financial reports. And the one thing I wanted to point out before opening up to the board is you might have noticed in this version of the flowchart in the CP, some of the text got cut off. So somehow when we converted to a PDF, all the formatting got changed. But if you look at the version in the board paper, that's the complete flowchart. So I think the last line in each of the boxes got cut off in the CP version. And also, before I open it up, we did receive one comment from a member asking if we should really separate the box on meeting the definition of an asset and whether it's measurable into two boxes. So for example, or the first box would say, does this meet the definition of an asset? And if it says no, then you would only really have discussion of this item in the general purpose financial reports and nothing in the financial statements. Whereas if you meet the definition of an asset and then you consider if it's measurable or not, if it's not measurable, you would have specific disclosures in the financial statements. Okay, so I'll pause now to get the board's reactions.
So thanks, Edwin, for that clarification. I must admit, that a similar question had occurred to me personally when I saw it. Although I'm always, as you know, everyone knows, I'm always a fan of flowcharts. Take any comments from members. David.
Thank you, Ian. When we had a discussion in the UK before this meeting, we all liked this flowchart very much. So thank you for it. The only comment that we wondered was in the bottom two blue boxes where you so consider giving information in the GPFRs, we did wonder whether you might reference the RPGs because you actually reference the actual IPSASs in the other white box. We thought that might be helpful.
Thanks, David. So take Mike's comment and then I'll go back to you, Edwin, after that.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Edwin. Yeah, I also like the diagram and I agree with the change that David's proposing and that was mentioned earlier. I just wondered, in the diagram that I've got on page 18, it refers at the top to a living organism. But what you've just shown us, Edwin talked about a biological item. So there's been some change thinking since the papers went out. And how does a living organism or a biological item compare to a living resource? Are we mixing terms? I'm just not sure why we got to have different terms. And then I thought the left-hand box, which talks about existing standards, doesn't pick up IPSAS 31 at the moment. And was there a reason why you dropped that out?
Thanks, Mike. Edwin, back on those points.
Yeah, it should be living organisms. I think I just made a mistake in the slide, but I think when we're talking about living resources in the general description, it starts with living organisms. So I'll use the consistent wording. And as for IPSAS 31, we purposely left out intangibles because when we're thinking of living resources, I couldn't really think of any living resources that were intangible in nature. So it was really done on purpose.
Okay, thanks for that. Chris and then Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Mine is about the separation of non-recognized and non-recognized natural resources. If we do not recognize natural resource as an asset, what then would we be doing? I mean, what would we need to consider disclosure in the financial statement? I think if we don't recognize, then it should only be disclosed in the financial reports, not in the financial statement.
Thanks, Chris. Edwin, back on that.
Yeah, so it goes back to the presentation chapter. So the disclosures on unrecognized or natural resources in general are a lot more limited. And it basically is really talking about if you have some sort of custodian relationship, or if it's something that meets the definition of an asset but cannot be measured. It's really just stating that fact in the statements that you have these potential assets that are not recognized because they're not measurable. So it's not the full-blown disclosures that we would need or we would propose for recognized natural resource assets.
So I think probably the point is actually, can you have a further look and see whether we can just make the explanation and the signposting clearer to address, Chris's question?
Yep.
Okay. Good, thank you. So Lucy, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The presented revised decision tree has actually effectively simplified the determination whether or not a living organism qualifies as a living resource within the scope of the CP. However, I have some comments on the applicability of IPSAS 27, 12, and 17. I don't know how it can be done, but I recommend further elaboration in the decision tree describing which circumstance or activity that is specifically applicable to the three IPSASs. These are actually described in paragraph 5.10 instead of just mentioning that the accounting depends on the nature of activities. Maybe we can expound further that, for instance, with this IPSAS 27, then this pertains to the living organism subject to agricultural activity. For IPSAS 12, then these are the items that are agricultural produce that have been harvested and so on. For 17, these are the bearer plants. Instead of just it's too general, so I think it will become more helpful to the stakeholders to understand just merely looking at the decision tree. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And it probably is there's a kind of general point, isn't there, about using the flow charts to tie the section together and putting some cross references in, for example, to that discussion that you've just alluded to, so that we don't overcomplicate the flow chart, but so that people can understand where the text is actually covered. So Edwin, in terms of the specific that Lucy actually raised, is that covered elsewhere appropriately, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's actually in the paragraph right before the flow chart. So what I could do is in the flow chart, just have a cross-reference back to 5.10 to say it's discussed in detail there.
Okay. Or we might think about, does that paragraph actually follow? I don't know anyway. So yeah, but I think if you can have a look at that, that would be helpful.
Okay.
And there probably is a general point, I think, throughout, which is we probably need to be careful not to give the impression that because I think there may be a need to add either some implementation guidance or something like that to the existing standards. So we probably need that thought in at some place, and then to just think about how we refer to those standards as well. Because that's something that we would need to review in the next stage of the project, I think, if we needed to propose any additional guidance or examples to make the linkages clear with natural resources. Okay, David.
Just picking up on that point, Ian, I mean, I haven't looked in detail right this minute, but should we think about asking an SMC on whether or not we think additional guidance is required for natural resources that we believe are already covered by standards?
Can we pass that question back to the task force to have a look at and see whether there's a logical place to deal with it? I mean, I think certainly the more information we can get from constituents, and that would be a relevant question. Okay, good. Okay, so I think with that, Edwin, we go back into the presentation.
Okay, so we've already talked about the first bullet. The other significant change in living resources is we have amended the section on measurement. And as members recall from September, we were asked to be less categorical about the measurement of operational capacity. So in the previous draft, we just said if an item or if we're trying to measure the operational capacity of a living resource, it's not really possible. And the reaction to that was not good. So we have revised it to be more open, and we have talked about what to think about when measuring a living resource. And we have revised the chapter to say that you should consider both financial capacity and operational capacity. And we've just left it as a statement to say that, when trying to measure operational capacity, it might be more difficult. So right now it's not a black and white. We're just saying that based on the techniques and the scientific approaches that are available today, you may have difficulties coming up with a valid measurement for operational capacity. So I'll pause there to get the board's reaction.
Thanks, Edwin. Comments from board members? Thumbs up from Adrian. Lynn, you want to come in?
So this point on human intervention and conservation or preservation activities, I think you've had a go at it in 5.15. I found the paragraph itself quite difficult to understand. But I guess my point is I think we ought to also be saying something more about conservation and presentation earlier on, up in 5.4 as well, where we don't actually, in 5.4, when we talk about human intervention, we don't use the words conservation and preservation at all in that paragraph.
Thanks, Lynn. Edwin, you happy to take that one away as an instruction? Mm-hmm. I think that's always that's certainly helpful. Thanks, Lynn, for that. Any other comments on the approach that's been taken and where we've landed? Okay, so that sounds good. So do you want then to just take any further member comments at this stage, Edwin, on the chapter as a whole?
Well, I was wondering if you wanted to do a page flip again, even though we've already done that last time.
Happy to do that. Yeah. Okay, so looking at the version in the papers, any comments on paragraphs 5.1 through 5.6? I think those are all pretty much as before. 5.7 through 5.10, and revisions there on 5.9 and 5.10. 5.11 then leads us into the flow chart. So then 5.12 through 5.18. You highlighted paragraph 5.15 there. Then we've got 5.19 through 5.20. And then 5.26 through 5.34. Highlight on 5.32. 5.35 through 5.37. Yep, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a minor comment in the graph in paragraph 535. In human intervention, when we are mentioning for living resources, I was thinking it should be perhaps for living organism, because I thought living resources and human intervention were not compatible. So maybe it was a typo or just a minor comment. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Camira, for that spot. Okay, so back on the page flip, I think we're at 5.38 through to 5.45. And then 5.46 through 5.51. Yes, Mary.
Thank you. About 5.44, mentioned about the measurement basis will be challenging and contradictory. The 5.50, it can be measured based on the operational value. It is not contradict my question.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Edwin, any immediate point, or do you want to take that one away as an instruction to make sure that there's consistency between those two? Edwin, back on that.
I guess what I try to do is in 551, I kind of say, yes, it's potentially doable to measure it, but then in general, it would be difficult. So I think if we were to combine those two paragraphs, then it would be consistent throughout.
So if you can have a look at that, and also in doing that, obviously, then there's a consistency point in terms of other sections. Okay. So then we have 5.46 through to 5.51. We have the preliminary view 9. Just pause on that, see if there are any comments on that. And then we're into the final 3 paragraphs, 552, 5 to 554. Good, okay. So move us then back into chapter 4 on water.
Yep. Okay, so the next chapter we're going to talk about is water. And the first bullet point is we've revised the chapter so that when we talk about removing water from its natural state, we now use the term processed. And I kind of want to just skip over this point because we've had a long discussion about this in September, if board members recall. So it's really just implementing the changes that were instructed back at that meeting. The second major change in water is similar to living resources. We've broadened the measurement section to say that you have to think about both financial and operational capacity. And similar to living resources, we do have a caveat in there saying, it is, you do have to think about both, but it might be more difficult to come up with a measurement basis for operational capacity. And then there are also two minor revisions on the chapter. One is really addressing an instruction to include the consideration of legislative and legal mechanisms for access rights. And the other one is broadening the presentation of information. And in the previous section, we've only talked about the volumes of water. So now we've talked about volumes and other qualitative information. And I guess before I throw it back to the board, I did receive a comment on PV4, and it's more of an oversight on my part. So we have revised the text to say that we have to consider both operational capacity and financial capacity, and that it might be more difficult to measure operational capacity. But the PV is still saying that if you're holding water for operational capacity, it's not possible to have a measurement basis. So the suggestion is to revise the PV so it's less categorical and use the similar wording that we have done for living resources. And then another comment I got was, so if you recall, if members recall from earlier meetings, we used to have water coming in at the end, but we flipped the ordering so that water would follow subsoil resources. And the reasoning for that was because a lot of the thinking that goes into groundwater, which is not observable, is similar to the reasonings for subsoil resources, and why we don't think, or why we think it would be difficult to recognize an asset for that. So the comment I got was, should we not explicitly point out that link? Because right now it's not really in the text of the chapter at all. And I think that was totally the intention, was to have it in the chapter. It's just that we didn't have it explicitly in there. Okay, so I'll open it back up for the board for comments.
Okay, so thanks, Edwin. I think there's a couple of instructions there that you've picked up on. So the consistency point on PV4, and certainly I think that's a good linkage to get that reasoning in about the similarities in terms of groundwater to subsoil. So I think that makes sense just to do that. Any other comments on those recommendations? And we will move to a page flip after this, but just comments on recommendations. Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Regarding that comment about the groundwater, just want to clarify that what I would expect we do is it's not just a simple link, and maybe that's not what you meant, but it's to update the discussion so that it's more judgmental, that we're not closing shutting the door down as it's perceived here. So okay, I see Edwin's Ed. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Renee. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised. So Edwin, anything else before we just do a page flip on this?
No.
Okay, oh, Renee, sorry.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is the time to raise it. It's a substantial comment I have. I don't know if it's subject to page flip, but we're still concluding very strictly and very quickly on the fact that water in its natural state cannot be an asset. And at this early stage in the project, we find that we're really shutting the door down to a potential healthy discussion with our stakeholders on that. So I don't know if this is the proper time to raise this, but wondering if there should be an SMC on this, if we keep it strict like that, the way it's now drafted, add an SMC so that we can capture respondents' reactions to that in a structured way, or is there appetite here to reword and be a bit more nuanced and not conclude so drastically at this point?
Thanks, Renee. Edwin.
Yeah, so I guess that's the point I was raising earlier on PV4. The intention is to revise the PV and also the accompanying text in the CP so that it's not as categorical and it's more nuanced. So I think if we were to look back to the subsoil chapter, right now we don't actually say you cannot recognize it as an asset. We say that it might be difficult, right? So I plan to use the same wording and the same type of reasoning to get there for water as well.
Okay, and maybe clean up some other areas. Okay,
yeah.
Great, related to that point. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, again, that goes back into why are we making preliminary views, because we're trying to state a clear direction of travel for people. But on this one, we are actually leaving some room. But either way, you know, what we're doing is we're soliciting, aiming to solicit feedback and comment on those proposals. So this doesn't bind us in any way. You know, it's actually just, this is where our thinking has got to, this is our proposed way forward. And, you know, if you do support that, then we'll proceed in that way. If you have comments on that, then we need to think again and take that into the ED stage of the project. Mike.
I think you've explained what I was worried about. Having listened to Renee, thanks, Ian. And then when I look at PV8, and maybe that's the one that Edwin's going to tinker with, I'm not sure. But at the moment, we've been pretty categoric in A to say that certain types of water will not be an asset. But you're right. That doesn't mean people can't come back and say they don't agree with us. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the nature of the CP. You know, I think the main thing is we need to put preliminary views in to give our constituents that this is our analysis, this is our views, how we'd move forward. Can you let us know whether you agree with that or whether you have other comments to make that we need to factor into the development of draft guidance, whatever that may be?
Yeah, so then I just wanted to, if I can have a comeback there, Ian. I mean, in B, I know we're getting into detail now, but in B we say control can be achieved, whereas in A we maybe should say control can't be achieved, or just broaden that out to say why we've
well,
got.
can we not draft at the moment? But I think we note that we note the concern expressed. I think the other thing though is we should be careful that if we, you know, if we're fairly clear on something, we make that clear. You know, I think there are certain areas where we're deliberately vaguer, but there are other things where we are actually pretty clear at the moment, and we need to make sure the PV then fits with the, you know, with the discussion. So I think that's really why we're giving this extra period between now and the March meeting to make sure, you know, we're happy with where we've landed and that we've got the consistencies and the references in the document. Okay, Lynn.
Yes, I guess it's a point that's linked to all the points that have just been made. But I think what I found in this chapter is a sort of not a mixing up, but it wasn't clear to me around the consideration of control on, say, for example, a lake where you might have legal ownership of an entire lake, and you might be able to meet 4.16, but then in 4.17, the arguments as to why we didn't control it, I wasn't quite clear. And is it around actually it's that I can't measure it, I've got existence uncertainty or measurement uncertainty, but I did control it. Now I think what Edwin, you were saying is you're going to revisit these paragraphs in using similar arguments to subsoil, but I do think there needs to be a crispness around consideration of control versus then existence and measurement uncertainty, and it wasn't quite crisp enough for me on that at the moment, or clear enough for me on that.
Okay, thanks for that, Lynn. So I think we take that away as an instruction, then to sort of have a look at that and you know, get that clarification, that consistency there. Okay, so then just continuing then with the page flip, I think we're on 433 to 440. Ajith.
Thanks, Ian. You have to excuse me for the lighting today because here we are going through a power crisis here. So I'm also referring to page in the water project. First of all, I want to thank the staff for improvements made in relation to water. I think there is considerable improvement that have been made in relation to the text of the water. Can you can't hear?
Yeah, sorry, I just realized I'd gone into a page flip when we were actually talking about the PV actually, so apologies. But anyway, make your point and then I'll take us right back in the section.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the staff for making the improvements in relation to the water paper. I think there is considerable improvement in relation to water paper. And also, I think it was mentioned that the PV will be also changed to something similar to the living resources PV. So I think with all that, I think there is a considerable improvement in the water chapter, and I think it looks like what it should be. There's a couple of comments I want to make in relation to paragraph 4.5. In paragraph 4.5, one item is that water may be processed when it is, and in subparagraph B, it says is moved from reservoirs and canals. I think the word moved is not appropriate because water is more, it's diverted or channeled rather than moved. So I think because no physical or no energy is used to move water, it's diverted or channeled. So that's one point. Then I also want to understand what the staff had in mind in note 28. The note 28 talks about water used for the water, it says the point of removing water in hydroelectricity power stations from its natural state may depend on how the power station is designed. For example, when water in turbines is still in its natural state, if it circulates back to the water in reservoirs and canals in the process of generating electricity. In contrast, water is removed from its natural state when it does not circulate back to reservoirs and canals, but is rather stored in closed containment systems. I would like to understand what the staff had in mind when this paragraph was written, because it doesn't seem to match with what normally happens in hydroelectric power systems. So if I can have a clarification, then I could respond to that matter. So can I get a clarification from the staff related to note 828?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks, Ajith. To you, Edwin.
Yeah, so I guess we were thinking about situations. So I don't know if everyone has visited Niagara Falls here, but essentially there's a power station right at the waterfall. And we're saying that if it's a situation like that where the water is just flowing through the generator, then you can't really say you control the water in the waterfall because it's not in an enclosed system at all. You're just having a power station sitting at the edge of the falls. And in contrast, if you have a system or if you have a power plant where you actually have water that's contained and that you can measure and monitor and control, then that would be a stronger case to argue that you have control over the water. So part of it really depends on the physical aspects of the structure. Yeah. So I don't know if that helps clarify.
Yeah, I understand what you mentioned. If you have a turbine at the bottom of Niagara Falls, then you're not actually having control over the water. But I think this note 28 appears to point to something else, because it's talking about 4.5 talks about water, processed water and unprocessed water. And in processed water, what 4.5 is saying is water may be processed when it, B says, is moved from reservoirs and canals into turbines to generate electricity power and then stored in closed reservoirs. Now, in water, what normally happens in the water system is that in a hydroelectric power system is that you have water at a higher level, in a higher level reservoir, and then the water is through pipelines, first through tunnels and then through pipelines, it's moved to a lower level power station, where at the power station, because of the change in levels, the water starts moving fast, and the movement of the water is used to turn the turbine. Then after that, the water is normally put out into either downstream into the same stream or in another stream at a lower level. And then sometimes you can use the water again by creating another reservoir at that point. You can have another dam there and make another reservoir, and again take the water again to a downstream level and have another power station. Now, you can repeat that several times, and then eventually water will end up in the sea. But you don't normally.
Ajith, on this one, I'm going to suggest that we take this offline.
Okay.
You know, I think there's a combination of two things here. One is, you know, we need to just make sure that the text that we've got is consistent in terms of the way it explains the principles. I think we need to avoid getting too detailed at this stage, because this is only actually explaining ideas. It's not guidance per se. So we're not writing an exposure draft at this stage or amending the inventory standard or whatever. So I think, you know, Edwin, I'll ask, I think the instruction is if you can work offline with Ajith to make sure that we get that consistency in drafting. Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, thanks, Ajith. So yeah, I think actually, sorry, I got diverted by the fact we were doing the PV. I think we were just about to do the page turn on the section actually. So if we can do that, I think that's right, Edwin, isn't it? I'm now back in the right place. Okay, so if we can just do the sort of page turns, so 4.1 through 4.3. 4.4 through 4.6, 4.7 through 4.10, 4.11 through 4.13, 4.14 through 4.18, 4.19 through 4.25, 4.26 through 4.32 with the highlighted sections in there. And then we've talked about the PV, so 4.33 through 4.40. Okay, so with that, we're through the page flip on that. So Edwin, take us back into the other issues you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So there was another paper on other significant revisions to the CP, but I really just want to touch on one point, which I think is important for the board, and that's on existence uncertainty. So between September and now, I've received a number of drafting comments and questions asking, when we talk about existence uncertainty, why are we bringing up control or past event? And I just want to clarify for the board, and also it's amended in the CP now, that when the conceptual framework talks about existence uncertainty, it's referring to uncertainty over the existence of an asset. So it's not really just uncertainty over whether a resource physically exists. It's also talking about, is there uncertainty over whether the entity controls the resource? And is there uncertainty over whether the past event has occurred? So that's why when we talk about existence uncertainty, it's not just the narrow aspect of whether something is there. It's also, does the entity have control of it, and has the past event already occurred? So I've revised the CP in chapter 2, where we talk about the recognition and measurement principles, to flesh that out, to make it consistent with what's the discussion is in the conceptual framework.
Thanks, Edwin, for directing us to that. Lucy, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. No, I just want to be clarified on. Now, I agree with Edwin on the discussion on existence and uncertainty, but I am confused in PV2, where it appears that if a natural resource is not subject to significant, it said there that significant existence uncertainty, then it can be recognized. So, but when I read on paragraph 2.2, there are only two criteria, recognition criteria, which is it meets the definition of an asset as defined in our conceptual framework, and it can be measured reliably. But in letter A in PV2, it appears that it is if it is not subject to significant existence uncertainty, then it appears that it is another recognition criterion. So I think there should be a cleaning up necessary in the PV to just limit the two recognition criteria, and perhaps the existence uncertainty actually is mentioned in PV2 letter C. So I suggest we delete it in letter A, or I don't know. It is confusing. It appears that this is another recognition criterion. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Edwin, back on that.
Yeah, so I think a better approach is to use the two recognition criteria, so we're 100% consistent with the framework. And then in the criterion where we say, does this meet the definition of an asset? Talk about existence uncertainty there, because that's how it's framed in the framework as well. So after saying, is it a resource? Is it controlled? Is it a past event? There should be some wording to say, when you're thinking about those three, we should also consider uncertainty in whether it's really a resource, it's really controlled, and there really is a past event. So I can certainly rephrase that PV and make sure it's consistent throughout the chapter as well.
Okay, thanks for that. And if you can, in doing that, work with Lucy just to make sure that that's addressed her concern on that, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Chair, can I?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead, Lucy.
Yeah, and Edwin, I suggest that we don't use significant existence uncertainty, because it is so confusing, it is relative, and there is no discussion in the CP what significant or insignificant existence uncertainties. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. And I think that, what we need to do, which Edwin, I think you were picking up on, is we need to be entirely consistent with the framework and the language that's used there. So thanks for that, Lucy. Okay, so that's sort of covered us off on 218 and 219. Was there any other points of principle, Edwin, you wanted to pick up? I'm sort of conscious it might be quite helpful just to make sure we're happy on the other shaded yellow paragraphs in the section.
So most of the other paragraphs that were shaded were really just editorials for the board's instructions. So I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time on that.
Maybe just if I ask, are there any other questions, any other points people want to pick up on chapter 2 then? No, okay, that's good. So Edwin, anything else from your perspective at the moment?
Nope, that's all we needed. And I guess we still have 5 minutes, so I do want to talk about the next steps for the project. Yeah,
that was exactly what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So as I've mentioned before, we're trying to essentially nail down all the issues at this meeting, and it sounds like we have some good directions and instructions to go on. And to me anyway, it didn't seem like there were any major concerns. So the plan is to finalize the drafting in Q1. And I'll work with the task force to make sure that all the instructions that were from this meeting are incorporated. And then the plan for March 2022 is really the final approval of the text of the CP. And at least my intention is that we don't open up any new issues, because it seems like we've already settled everything. And the target publication date for the CP then will be April of next year. Oops.
Thanks, Edwin. And so I think the request to members, if you haven't already passed through drafting amendments as soon as you can. In terms of the focus for March, obviously we'll focus on changes that have been made since this meeting. We will really want to make sure that we go through the PVs and make sure we're totally happy with the PVs and also the SMCs in finalising. So, you know, that was really the reason why we wanted to go through the points of principle, so the whole thing is really settling down, you know, in time for us to walk through and approve in March. Okay, so anything else anybody else wants to raise at this stage on the natural resources? It seems to me that has moved forward significantly since September. I think, you know, Edwin, thank you very much for all the hard work you put in. Thank you to the task force and to members of the pass-through comments. This is feeling in a good place now. So I think with that, we wrap up for today, and then we are now back on track in terms of the timetable for the meeting, and we're ready to move on tomorrow to revenue and transfer expenses. Okay, thanks everyone. Good session today, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow.